So, good day. Welcome to another episode of the INTUNE podcast with myself, Ashley Velvet Frost. I have a really wonderful guest here with me today, Joana Bartlett, who is hello. So, thank you so much for being here. And it's such an honor to have Joana here. She's really somebody who is embodying the alpha frequency of INTUNE, which is the physical body. So Joana works with women as a nutritionist and focusing in particular on interstitial cystitis, which is a disease, but I'd say affliction that I personally have also suffered with when I was much younger. So this is something really close to my heart. And I know how awful and terrible the symptoms and suffering of it can be. So Joana's going to be joining me today, telling me about her journey, telling me about what she offers, how people who are suffering from this can heal, and also how you can support people in your life who may also be suffering from this. So Joana, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, likewise. So I can hear from your accent that you're British, but
Yes.
you are, I think, not in Britain at the moment. So where are you calling in from at the moment?
So I'm half English, half Spanish. I do live in Spain at the moment. So I've just moved back from Australia a couple of months ago, where I was living with my partner, and we've just got back. So yeah, over in Spain, which is lovely, much sunnier. So yeah, but originally from the UK, from the East Coast.
And from what I gather, you have just come back from Australia, where you had began your journey of training to be a nutritionist. So I'm going to give you the floor a little bit to tell me a bit about how you got here, what it is you're doing, and yeah, to give a little bit of insights into yourself.
Yeah, so thank you. I started suffering with recurring UTIs when I was, I had my first UTI when I was 19. One-off UTI, didn't think anything of it. I went to the doctors, took antibiotics, like the usual uncomplicated UTI, not a problem. And then I started getting really chronic UTIs when I was about 21. So I had a very toxic relationship with my ex-partner, who was French. And every time I would go to France or he would come to the UK and we were intimate, I would get a UTI without fail every single time. So we're talking every 3 to 4 weeks, I would have a UTI. I would clear it and then we'd see each other and then I'd get another one. And it got to a point where I stopped going to the doctors for it because I knew what it was and I didn't want to take any more antibiotics. So I started treating it naturally with herbs and cranberry tablets and all of these things, and that was fine, and we broke up, and my symptoms did actually improve. But it then happened that every time I went out heavily drinking, or I would go out, so my body was really dehydrated, or anytime I would have, it wasn't every time I had sex, it was some of the times I would get a UTI or UTI sort of symptoms. And then, yeah, it kind of just sort of stayed the same. And then my mum got sick. So my mum got cancer again. And things started to be worse, right? And I couldn't quite understand it. So I would eat certain things and I would have worse symptoms, or I would drink alcohol and I would have more symptoms. And yeah, it just all sorts of, everything started to feel a bit different. So my, there were still urinary symptoms, very much. That was what was affected. But I think the location of the pain changed, which was really interesting. And so I started going back to the doctors and they said, well, there's no bacteria, there's nothing there that could be prompting it. Mm-hmm. And I was told very nicely by a doctor, he said, well, some women just live with it. You're just going to have to get over it, basically. I was like, oh, that's good. Great. Fantastic. So nobody actually knew what was wrong with me, but just that some people actually just live like that, and that's kind of it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was really, really difficult. That was when I was still living here, I think. Yeah, it must have been. And my symptoms were bad, but they weren't debilitating, and I didn't have an answer, basically. And When my mum passed away, the symptoms continued to be strange and I couldn't make any sense of them. And I was trying all of these different dietary things. And I was also getting repeat yeast infections. I was getting repeated thrush. And it was just all of these things that were manifesting as anything, you know, in pelvis related, really. Horrible period pains, nasty periods, infections, like all of these things. So when I moved to Australia, so I didn't notice any connection. So it wasn't having, you know, it wasn't stopping me living my life. It was just incredibly annoying. I moved to Australia and my symptoms got worse and worse and worse and worse. And I finally went to speak to a urologist, which I had to pay for privately because nobody public would see me. And she diagnosed me with interstitial cystitis finally. So I'd had it for years. I mean, I started getting symptoms at 21 and it just, was having symptoms for years. And I'd Googled it. I was aware of what it was and I suspected, the wind. And I suspected that I had it. But everything that you read online, it's like this catastrophic, life-changing, horrendous diagnosis. And it's like, well, oh my God, if you have IC, your life is over. You're never going to live like a normal person ever again, right? That's the kind of idea that you're given by, to be honest, in my experience, both doctors and the internet. And I just want to make it really clear that that's actually not the case. So from there I basically started training as a nutritionist. I started realizing the effects that food had. I kept what I called a wee diary. So I would have what I'd eaten plus when I'd been for a wee, so how many times I'd been, and rate my wee out of 10. So 4 out of 10 is not great. 8 out of 10, like great wee, well done.
Was it really good? Sorry. That joke had to be said. Carry on.
Some of them were really good, but the problem is they were really, really bad. But yeah, so it was just very bizarre trying to put everything together and trying to figure out exactly what was happening. And I wasn't really given any medical guidance at all. And I was referred to a pelvic floor therapist, and I was like, great, this is going to be my breakthrough, because everyone says, from what I've read on all the forums, that they see so much relief from pelvic floor therapists, but there wasn't really anything wrong with my pelvic floor. So I was just kind of left plummeted into just being baffled, until I realized how much food played a part. And then I realized that my gut played a part. So whenever I would get a yeast infection, which for me were also hormonal as well, so my hormones were imbalanced, my gut was imbalanced, my nervous system was having a field day of despair and distress. And I also was told, which nobody had told me before, that I'd had a couple of nasty falls and hit my coccyx on a stair, sort of the actual, the corner bit of the stair, a couple of times, and that can cause really nasty pelvic floor issues without there necessarily being anything wrong with the muscles there. So there were so many things that went into it. It was emotional, there was some physical aspects to it, some food aspects that my body wasn't tolerating, and all of it just put my body into a complete state of stress, and ended up with basically what was happening was I had urinary symptoms, because there was nothing physically wrong with my bladder or my urethra. They were, anatomically, when you looked at them, there was nothing there. There was nothing wrong. I had all of the ultrasounds, everything. There was nothing wrong with how much urine I could hold or with anything like that. It was just all of the other things which went in there and just basically created symptoms. And, I've now had absolutely no symptoms for over a year. I live my life completely normally. I've just moved back from Australia to Spain. And, there were my worst flare. I remember I was in bed for about 2 months. I couldn't do anything because I was just in so much pain. I wasn't sleeping. Everything in my body was on such high alert. And I look that person to the person who was able to travel for 36 hours and move continent and do all of these things.
Yeah.
And, you know, it is also just a message that it is possible. This isn't like it's not a life sentence. And I think that's the biggest thing, that particularly when we have something like UTIs and things like that, it's so uncomfortable that it does actually feel like a life sentence, and it does feel like you'll never get better, but it does get better. And there is a way through it, and it's not a never ending pain cycle forever, basically.
Yeah, and this is something I really want to touch on, is how to come out of it, because I remember also having gone to the doctors and they're like checking the bladder, checking all of these things, and it's like, and also not quite believing you. They're like, oh, well, maybe it's not that bad, and it's almost, you almost have to live the experience to really empathize with somebody when they're going through something. But it's almost just like, listen to us as women, that this is
There is
really,
something
really
wrong.
painful. Yeah, and it's not necessarily because there's genetically something wrong. I remember, it's funny you say this, because I also was with a previous relationship, weirdly also France connected, with trips and stuff. And
Wow.
I, yeah, very odd. And I recently had the mother of this previous partner being like, yeah, I was always very worried. You always had lots of UTIs and things going on. And it's like, yeah, but that's not a genetic flaw. It's something that's coming from the energetics, the relationship, the what I'm eating. This was all at uni. This is all when you're drinking and
So much
eating.
alcohol is
Yeah,
involved. There's so
so
much
much alcohol.
sex as well. There's just
Yeah,
so much crap going into the body that
yeah,
just doesn't need to be there.
yeah. So I mean, I'm sure people listening, if they've suffered through this, and I have many women in my life who are suffering with this still nowadays, and it feels really like hopeless and
It does.
painful. Yeah, chronic pain in itself, anything chronic, it's like taking a bit of your soul and your energy each day, and you're not really able to be there present as
No.
yourself, because it's like you're planning around the bathroom, you're planning around like, if I go running, my bladder's gonna hurt, or if I'm bumping in the car, it's gonna hurt or something. It's like, yeah, I think it's very important that we're here talking about this as well today, because it's something that we both really deeply have felt.
Well, as soon as I speak to anybody about what I do,
Mhm.
it's everybody either knows somebody or them themselves have had really nasty effects of chronic UTIs.
Yeah.
And it's something which actually we all suffer from, really. We all either suffer from it ourselves or we know someone who has, and we don't talk about it, and we don't talk about what can help it and alternative ways of doing it, because being on antibiotics forever is just not a solution.
Oh.
But that is a solution that one doctor gave me. He told me to just go on a low dose antibiotic for 3 months.
And
But
they
that's
also,
not an answer.
of course not. Like you said, you also get thrush from going on antibiotics often, and it throws the gut into more disbalance. It's almost like, oh yeah, that's just a side effect. You have to deal with that, like thrush after. You're like,
No.
no, not at all. So, okay, so then let's talk about then a bit of like this alternative healing methods that you've come across. I know that you're running coaching programs with women, supporting them on this. So yeah, I'm curious also, because this is also, people really need this, and yeah, I'm really curious what these methods are.
Yeah, so with interstitial cystitis, there's a lot of things that that need to be looked at. So the gut is a huge one that needs to be looked at, big one. Hormones, huge one. The nervous system is massive, right? So when the nervous system is in fight or flight for too long, it's when we start to see lots of problems with chronic gut issues and chronic hormonal imbalances anyway. So just those two can be affected by the nervous system alone. The pelvic floor is very, very commonly we store a lot of our stress in our pelvic floor, in our jaws, and in our shoulders, right? And so when we're holding a lot of stress in our jaw, we tend to then hold the same stress in our pelvic floor. And if our muscles are constantly tightened, then we can then also have urinary symptoms. So that is something which needs to be looked at. Falls and stuff, which can affect your coccyx or anything sort of in that area, can also impact it. And inflammation in the body, so diet is a huge thing in this. So inflammation with what we're actually eating is a big thing, and drinking, and it's all of these things paired together. And then it really is kind of just picking the bits that sort of seem to affect you most to kind of put the pieces together of the puzzle and try to work to a solution. But it's all revolves, and actually starts with the nervous system.
Okay.
When you start, we can do all of the diets in the world, we can do all of the cleanses that we want to, but if we aren't working through, constantly being in fight or flight and constantly having problems around the nervous system, they're not going to work. I have been on so many candida cleanses and the typical sort of IC diet that's explained and suggested that people do, and none of it had any impact because my nervous system was so shot that my body was it wasn't able to heal.
I had a podcast guest previously, and she was really saying that healing can only happen in the parasympathetic nervous system. So anything else in between is not going to happen. Like it's just like you're wasting your money and your time. And I guess then my question is, how does someone, and I know this is a topic in itself of regulating the nervous system, but what tips would you give to someone? So say Joana, age 19, early 20s, who's coming in and is having all these issues, what kind of tips would you give her at the beginning to get started on this?
Breathing, big one, right? Getting our breathing, breath work is a really, really, really important technique for anybody trying to work with their nervous system. Emotional release. So I know this is definitely your field. So emotional release and getting rid of everything in the body that's no longer serving you is huge to be able to regulate, and actually just finding a pillow and screaming in it. Great. It's not going to fix everything, but it's going to help, right? It's, moving everything stagnant in the body to make you feel free and to get rid of those feelings of being weighed down, right? So all of those feelings, they need to go. So breath work, emotional clearing, even things like just making sure that you take time for yourself every single day. So particularly as women, we often feel like we need to do absolutely everything in the world, don't we? Like we need to be the best friend, and we need to be the best partner. We need to be the best in our job because we need to maybe be better than the male colleagues or be as good as, and we have to put more work in because we feel like we have to, and we feel like we have to do all of these things and do everything so perfectly that we forget that actually we need to be the best person for ourselves to do that. So taking half an hour to an hour to yourself every day, find a corner, read a book, go for a walk, listen to a podcast, whatever it is that makes you feel good, sitting there for half an hour and staring at a wall and thinking about the day. If that makes you feel good, do it. But you've got to take that time for yourself to actually be able to focus on your healing and everybody else around you. So I think that they would sort of be the big things. And looking, at myself, 18, 19, I was living I was eating properly, but I was drinking so much alcohol and I was not sleeping properly, which obviously is very, very common at that age, but it's so damaging to your body, right? Drinking so much, sleeping really badly, having, really awful sexual experiences with people you don't actually know or care about or have any interest in knowing. And, not looking after yourself in that way. And I think that can be so damaging to us, in 5 to 10 years further down the line. And actually feeling things, letting ourselves be vulnerable and all of these things is so important for us when we're younger as well. I think they would kind of be key for me, just sort of off the bat.
It's very interesting because there's 2 points on there. I think I really want to touch on the alcohol aspect because this is something that for most people is very integral in our lives. I don't know that many people who don't drink alcohol, even amongst the conscious circles of people. So what kind of impact does alcohol have on the bladder, and how does it worsen the symptoms that people get?
It dehydrates you. So for me, I would get a lot of symptoms with alcohol because it would dehydrate me, and my symptoms personally would get worse. Like even if I didn't drink enough water in a day, my symptoms would actually get worse.
I remember that as well.
So being incredibly dehydrated from drinking, it would just times things by a million. It's also inflammatory. It's also an irritant. It's a diuretic, right? So it's all of these things. So if you're already suffering with things like frequency and urgency, having anything that's a diuretic. So we're talking tea, caffeinated teas, coffee and alcohol are all going to make you need to wee more. So it's going to increase that frequency.
Yeah.
So it's going to dehydrate us, which we don't want. And, then there's all of the emotional aspects of drinking too much, right? So when we drink too much and we're hungover, whether that induces anxiety, whether sadness, whatever it is. And as you get older, it takes, if I drink now, it takes me a couple of days afterwards to feel good again. And
we will not reveal our age, but yes, I agree.
It gets worse. I'm not 18 anymore, and I can't jump out of bed and be like, I slept 3 hours and I drank half a litre of vodka and I still feel great, right?
I'm going to do it all again tonight.
The next 3 days in a row because I'm at university and that's what people do. But you can't do that. And, it's the emotional aspects of recovering from it. And it's, if it's one drink or two, it's not the same as drinking a whole bottle of wine. But even a drink or two, a lot of people notice that their urgency and their frequency get a lot worse. And, if we do have a lot of inflammation around the bladder, the alcohol can just make it worse and it can just create more pain. The wee anyway. So, yeah.
Okay, good to know. So how much water do you think people should be drinking on average if they are suffering with IC?
It really depends. So I drink minimum 2 litres a day. But it depends if somebody's having a lot of night frequency, I would always recommend stopping late afternoon, try and get your water in during the day, and then finishing, sort of 6ish, maybe not drink anything else afterwards, so that we're, really helping to make sure that you're not going so much in the night. But it depends on your size and weight, really, of how much. Rough estimate, 2 litres is generally what the advice is a day. I find that I like to drink a little bit more than that. My partner drinks 6 litres, complete extreme, unnecessary. But, it depends on how much physical activity you do in a day, how much you're sweating. It just, it's dependent. Rough guide is 2 litres a day, really.
Yeah, I had one of the podcast guests gave me this very interesting fact of for every shot of coffee that you drink, it dehydrates you 1 liter of water essentially. And so, and then she was like, yeah, so flat white is 2 shots. And I was like, oh my gosh, like if I've some days when you have a cup,
I need to drink.
So I'm always keeping that in mind in terms of coffee consumption as well, with then like not that I'm definitely drinking a liter with each coffee, but it's like just to keep it in mind that there is a lot of dehydrating that comes with coffee in particular, I find.
I didn't know that.
I'm schooling the nutritionist.
You are. I didn't realize it dehydrated you by a liter.
Yeah, she's a water fasting coach as well, so it's a lot of techniques with that. And I'm glad you touched on the emotions side of things, because this is as I'm also trained in emotional release, and there's like different symptoms manifest in the body. So that's why I do these interviews and discussions with INTUNE, because it's the holistic way. It's not just the body, it's not just the emotions, it's the soul, it's the spirit, it's everything coming together. And there's a real pattern that people notice with bladder infections. It's with boundaries being crossed. So it's interesting you say also with bad sexual experiences, or if there are, it's not that you're necessarily being traumatized or attacked by something, but it is definitely if you're doing things past your boundaries, and this can also happen in relationship, and it can happen in life if there's maybe someone in your life is stepping into your boundaries too much, that this also tends to show up. And it's just interesting because when I've reflected back, and I've done this with other women in my life, it's like, when did it show and what happened in like the week before? And it's super interesting to tap into those kind of emotions as well, especially with doing the emotional release, like you say, screaming into a pillow if you're feeling into someone crossing your boundaries, and like channeling that element as well, because it does happen through sex most of the time. And as women, we do carry a lot of trauma around sex, which is also not talked about as often. I'd say that's why I like that you're doing this, not just as a nutritionist, you are tapping into all the areas of the humanness with it as well.
Yeah, because there's so much of it. And, that part of us is so sensitive anyway, right? And then if you're sleeping with someone and it's a really toxic relationship, or if you just, you just don't fancy it one night, but you're still saying, yeah, I want better, right? You're actually not you're not honoring your body and what you actually want, and you're putting somebody else above you. And that's something which I've only learned sort of recently, right? And it's interesting because my symptoms started with boyfriends and with sex, and I was fully aware that it was incredibly a toxic relationship, but I ignored it. I completely ignored it, but my body was screaming at me saying, what are you doing? No, we don't want to do this. Stop it. And I ignored it for so long. So, and, you know, then symptoms manifest themselves as they do. And it's, you know, the emotional side and the need to scream it out or, you know, punch it out or whatever it is, it needs to come out somehow. And if not, it does trap itself in the body. And we do get symptoms of things like UTIs. And, you know, you read online, you read all this stuff of, you know, some women are just more prone to UTIs. It's, wow.
Like, or are they just carrying trauma from their ancestral and family line and their current traumas they're picking up that are then manifesting into that?
Or do we have exactly, or is there something else going on that's not spoken about? Because I remember going to my doctor in France. I got another UTI.
Yeah.
So I went to the doctor in France and I was like, oh, and he was a really lovely man, right? He was a man in his 60s and I was a 21-year-old girl. And I used to, in another life, be an English teacher. And he knew me because I'd had my wrist operation and he'd taken the stitches out after my surgery, right? He was really lovely. And I went to him and I was like, oh, doctor, I've got UTI. Anyway, he asked me about my partner, which I thought was so invasive because I was like, what's that got to do with anything? And he was like, oh, where's he from? He was from a bit of a rough part of town. And he was, you know, he was a painter decorator. He was older than me. He had a child, you know. He was asking me all these things. And then he was like, okay. And then he went, you need to have less sex when you're together. And I was like, I don't really think this has anything to do with you, but okay. And then he told me very interestingly that he had this woman who had been his patient for years, and her husband had been together since they were in school. And every time they did anything sexual, she would get a UTI. And he told me about it. And he was saying, you know, just don't get yourself in that situation, basically. And I didn't really understand what he meant, but I actually feel like looking back, I don't know if I'm reading into it too much, was him basically saying to me, look into this relationship to see if this is what you want. And he was like, you're an English teacher. He lives in the sort of rough part of town. He's a bit rough around the edges. He was like, just, you know, don't end up like this woman that, you know, even if it was stuff like something like fingering, she would get UTI or urinary symptoms.
Yeah. It's almost like you had like a little guardian angel and a French doctor come down and like whisper the path of healing to you. And
just trying to, not that he was trying to warn me, but there was definitely something in what he was saying, you know, that was kind of like, this woman, they've got kids and everything, you know, they're much further down the line, they're married, blah, blah, blah. She's not 21 anymore. And she's still getting UTIs, you know, that's not a life and all these things. So
yeah, and this is what interests me, because we can talk about the nutrition and the things you should eat and shouldn't eat and good supplements and herbs, which we will get onto because I want to know if there's anything that's beyond the norm. But this is something that's just never really touched on, never gone into detail. And that is that your body will just scream at you if something is not in alignment in your life. And you could ignore it. But yeah, like you say, that woman could be 30 years down the line in a marriage and living daily in pain, and clearly with a partner. And I understand it's like we're not always in a position to leave. There's a lot of subtones and texts under this as well as women. I do really think that like women coming together and talking about this as well, even if it's just on the internet to start, I'm sure that there were women's groups that you found or like forums, but to also know that you're not the only one going through this, and that means that there's nothing wrong with you. It's
well, that's a huge thing, right? Is there's so much stigma around it, and it doesn't, you know, I'm not saying that anybody who has IC, it's because they're in an unhealthy relationship, right? Absolutely not the case. In my case, that was where my symptoms started. But, you know, there's so many women who have so many similar stories, and that's not something which is looked into, whether it's, you know, 20 years ago when they were in their 20s, they had this relationship and it came out much later or anything like that. But, you know, we can look at all of the food and all of the supplements, but until we address what's trapped inside, and, you know, it doesn't have to be relationship trauma, it can be any type of trauma that we have inside, anything that we've not allowed ourselves to feel or express and to get rid of, it's going to come out one way or another, whether it's urinary symptoms, whether it's a different symptom entirely, it's going to come out. And it's, until you address it, it's either going to mean constant medication or, you know, dealing with the actual problems in the body as a whole.
Yeah, it's just the thought of living a life just on medication, it's and I'm not judging anybody who chooses to do that, but I just know that it's not, there is a lot more out there in terms of how you could live, and easier, less expensive. Like, we live in countries where it's okay with the price of medication, but some places in the world, the healthcare is very expensive as well. And it's like putting women at even more of a disadvantage. Like, oh, you have another thing that is caused by having sex with men that then you have to pay for. Oh, we're going to tax your tampons. All of these things, like, it's just like piling on. I wasn't expecting this to go down the route of more like the feminist liberation, but we're going there. There's such variety. Like, I want every kind of variety of topic on this. So it's,
but it's interesting. And, you know, when we live on medication, it does end up being expensive. And I think the problem is that, like, having a holistic view on it and an alternative view on it is not all, like, I was never told about it by anybody. There was not one single person in the medicine world who said to me, do you know what, it's not spoken about so much, but there are a few other things that you can try, because I know you're in pain and you're desperate. But they're not spoken about, so it's not so readily available to everybody because they don't know about it. Because they think that the only way is through doctors, and that is the only way to heal, because they don't know that there's another way, which I was never told about it. The only reason that I went down a more natural route was because we'd started to go down a more natural route for my mum's cancer. So that was the only reason that I started to look into a more sort of alternative way of healing things. But a lot of people, otherwise I would have had no idea. I would have had absolutely no clue.
Yeah, same. If I reflect back when it healed, I don't really know exactly what it was that healed it. I mean, that relationship ended and I've only had one ever since in my life in the last 5 years. So, I mean, infection, not relationship.
Maybe getting rid of boyfriend was the answer.
I think so. So yeah, it's also, but then if I really consider, and this has just come up as my next question, actually, hormones. Have you noticed, maybe with the people you're working with, whether they're taking hormonal contraception, whether they are natural? Does this also have an influence on the infections, on how cystitis shows up?
So it's very interesting, because some people find that when they go back on birth control, their symptoms stop. Which is interesting. And obviously it's not a solution, it's a band-aid approach, right? But their symptoms stop. And I also completely understand that when we are in so much chronic pain, we will do anything to stop the pain. Because when it's at a point where you cannot sleep, you cannot go out, you cannot cook for yourself, you spend your life being hobbled over, right? Like, anything that will stop the pain, you'll take. So some women do find that actually being on the pill works, and it does help them. Obviously that's not a long-term solution. For other people, they found that their symptoms started when they actually came off the pill. So, and they came off hormonal birth control. So it's really, really tricky, but there is usually a hormonal imbalance in there somewhere. So for me, my progesterone was too low, and my estrogen levels themselves are okay. But, we have different levels of hormonal imbalance. So for me, my progesterone was too low, which meant that I did actually have too much estrogen compared to my progesterone in the body. So that was my issue.
What would you recommend for people? Would you suggest, so with their hormones, going to get a blood test? Like, what is the normal process for, I mean, first establishing, and then it can be so many things. It could be the estrogen, progesterone. Like, how do people then find out how to naturally bring it back into balance as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, when I was working through all of my hormonal stuff, I was working with a fantastic naturopath, and she ran the tests for me. But there's things like the Dutch test is phenomenal because it also checks your cortisol, our stress hormone. So that's really good. Blood tests will show your hormones, but it just depends on the person reading them, the discrepancies there with the results. So generally, when we look at them holistically, we see a much smaller gap, whereas Western medicine will look at a much bigger gap as normal. So again, it just depends who's reading them. I would always recommend working with a naturopath, to be honest, to get hormones properly looked at and properly checked. But estrogen's a big one with urinary symptoms. So for example, for perimenopause and menopausal women, when our estrogen does change, we then do end up with problems with the bladder. So there actually could be something structural, with our estrogen levels being too low. And in that case, things like natural estrogen creams can be quite good. And there's different things which you can look into doing for that. And sort of vaginal pessaries with estrogen can be good. Estrogen creams that you can apply in the area can be very, very, very beneficial. If your progesterone is too low, I still do actually take a progesterone tablet, but it's a completely natural tablet, which again, I did all through my naturopath. So it just depends on where your hormones are and what they're doing, but it has such a big influence with the body. So yeah, it would all just depend on sort of how, the route that you wanted to go to take it, but definitely blood tests, or the Dutch testing, and then running through it with a specialist would be my recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite tailor-made as well, depending on what the outcome is of the test. Though I understand that you can't be like, you need to try this specific protocol, because it's really very personal. I mean, I think it's great that you are doing these coaching programs with people also and going through this step by step, holding their hands as well. And I know that nutrition has a really big influence, not just on hormones, but on the bladder as well. So I think this is like one of the other big areas that traditionally people go to first, which is why I've left it last, because I wanted to touch on the other ones before. So tell me a bit about the nutrition, what traditionally is advised to people to eat. Like, when I think of bladder infection, I think of cranberries and cranberries galore, and that's all I really know about it. And I think for the rest, everyone else is also probably like, I wouldn't know what to do, what not to eat, maybe not sugar. So how's the nutrition?
So what is recommended by, for example, the IC network is the IC diet, right? So this means we cut out any diuretics, so tea, coffee, alcohol. We cut out anything acidic, so tomatoes, lemons, oranges, whatever. We cut out lots of things: soy, anything acidic, coffee, alcohol. Reduce your sugar levels. And it does end up sort of just diminishing what you can. And get chocolate, for example. It does, particularly if you're plant-based and you do find that you eat a lot of soy, it can be quite difficult to cut something, that source of protein out. I personally don't advise doing that. So when we have IC, we tend to have different food and drink triggers, right? But I mean, once we start calming down the nervous system, we do find that we can integrate different foods back in anyway. So, for example, when my symptoms were really bad, I couldn't eat any type of sugar, natural or otherwise. So mangoes, I remember it was mango season and I was sat there with my spoon eating the mango. Bad idea for my bladder, turns out. My bladder was not a fan of that. So anything sugary was an issue. Tomatoes were an issue. Coffee was an issue. Sunflower oil was a really big issue. Anything fried was an issue. There were so many things that were a problem, and it would just cause me pain, right? So, but working with the gut and the nervous system and all these things, it doesn't have to be like that forever. But what I would say is that the best thing to do for IC is basically a properly controlled elimination diet. So this basically means we actually do remove all of those things, but we also remove, I always remove and would advise removing gluten, refined sugars, and dairy to start with, just to see, because there have been so many people who have actually realized that in removing those, even for a small time, can actually allow the body to heal and then reintroduce them slowly again. And then once we've done a full sort of cleaning process of that for a month, not always the most fun, but it's, you know, it is what it is.
What is it in a lifetime? That's what I try and tell people. It's like, it's 1 month out of thousands you're going to live. So
yeah. And then you start introducing things slowly again, one thing a week, just in small quantities. So on day one, you have a little bit. So let's say you're introducing, tomato. You have a little slice of tomato, see how it goes with the body. If you're okay, the next day have a little bit more, and on day 3 have a lot more, and just see how your body reacts. If it's all good, great. That's on the all good list. Wait a few days just to let the body recover, and then we start to introduce something else. So it's every week we introduce something new, and it's long, but it's the most effective way to basically figure out what you can and can't eat. One of my clients, for example, she couldn't eat chocolate when we started working together, and by the end she could eat a square. Not a lot, but it's better than nothing, and it's something which she can expand on. And it wasn't giving her any pain. So it's figuring out kind of what works for your body, and we can't really look at a complete diet and say this is going to work for every single person with IC, because it's not how it works. So it's by doing a proper elimination diet. Cranberries and cranberry tablets and cranberry juice is what's always advised with UTIs. The problem with cranberry juice is that there's a lot of sugar in there, and bacteria loves sugar, right? So if you've got a bacterial infection and you're eating sugar, you're basically just feeding it and saying, here, sprout more bacteria, please.
Where did this come from, the concept of, is this like an old wives' like tale of like it does help a little bit, or?
Yeah, there's an element of it being an old wives' tale. There is some, there are very, very few studies which have shown that it does have some kind of effect. But what seems to be there's a part within the cranberry called D-mannose, right? Spelt D-MANNOSE. And that is the part in cranberry which is supposed to actually clear the infection, and it's so it doesn't have all the other stuff in there. And that actually has shown to be very, very good. So things like D-mannose instead of cranberry, I would recommend. Aloe vera is incredibly soothing. There's actually a lot of studies now happening with aloe vera and interstitial cystitis. So I know Desert Harvest is the brand that a lot of people use and have very good results with.
This is all taking in tablet form, sorry.
Tablet form of it. Marshmallow root is very, very soothing to the bladder. The only thing with that is it's a diuretic. So if you're weeing a lot, some people don't notice any difference, others do. But that's a really, really good one. And pumpkin seed oil is people are seeing very, very good effects with those, as well as things to incorporate. But I would never recommend just literally saying from day one, right, I'm going to cut out all of the foods and I'm going to buy all of the supplements and I'm going to do it all from today onwards because, new year, new me. No, right? Step by step, because otherwise you get overwhelmed and you get really stressed. I know I do. And then afterwards you don't know what's actually worked and what hasn't, because you've started taking 4 different types of supplements and it gets really expensive, and then you can't afford them all, but you don't know which ones are helping to soothe your body, and it just gets really stressful. So I know it's difficult with chronic pain because you want to fix everything now because you're just in so much pain, but it really is slow and steady wins the race with this, to be honest.
And there's also, I find, like the initial cutting back of everything. I found this doing a candida diet, that you then get die-off symptoms. Like it almost gets worse before it gets better. You cut out all the things your body's been addicted to and loving and feeding off of, and all this bacteria is just going to be like screaming at you. So is there any tips you give people who are in, like, they say, the first couple of weeks of doing this, where it can get quite intense as well?
rest, like make sure you've got no big social plans, find really good alternatives and swaps. So this is something that I focus on with my clients, is that it's not particularly fun, but we can find really good alternatives and swaps for things, so that you know, essentially can create recipes and create foods that are still fun and still delicious, but without the parts in there that could potentially irritate the body. So, you know, and I actually just think the big thing is just rest. Like, you're going to be tired, you're probably going to be a bit grumpier than you would normally be, you're going to feel a bit woe is me, right? But rest up, and just you know, it's all part and parcel of it, and it's just sort of essentially dealing with it. It's crap, and it's not particularly fun, but you can make it more interesting, and you can make it as good as possible within that, when we think of an end goal, and when we think, okay, well, I'm just going to take a month, I'm going to rest, I'm going to see how all of this different stuff makes me feel. And you know, it's just a learning curve, and it's just a learning experience, so it's just sort of trying to take out the good from it and getting on with it, basically.
There's a beautiful thing somebody's shared with me before when I had very intense bladder infections, and it was also visualizing healing. So really meditating and going to that point in your body and seeing it like filled with light, and feeling like the urinary tract to be like smooth and like healthy, and to like feel it. And it's just, there's a lot in this as well, of also just the mindset, it's like
the
not
mindset's
to
a huge thing. Yeah,
it's not to discredit, because like it is awful to have chronic pain and to go through all the healing symptoms of it. And yes, there can be a greater purpose of, okay, you've found purpose from your pain, like you, as you are finding as well. Like, if you hadn't gone through this, or you would not be the Joana who stood here today.
No,
but it's in the moment that can be very difficult to tap into. So
absolutely. And there's something called somatic tracking. I'm sure you've heard of it, and it's basically where we picture the pain, basically. There's a fantastic book called The Way Out by Alan Gordon, and it's all about chronic pain, and he goes into somatic tracking in depth, and actually working on when we've got chronic pain, and working through the pain fear cycle that we find ourselves in is a huge part of coming out of pain, and actually visualizing the pain and talking to it and telling it, actually, we're safe and we are okay, and you don't need to be alerting me all the time, and we are okay, we're not in danger, you know. And it's talking, and it's almost like talking to your pain as though it was a really small child that you were trying to comfort, because that's all your body wants. It just wants to be comforted, and it just wants to be told that actually I am safe, and okay, yes, we're in pain, but brain, you don't need to be producing this much pain, because there's nothing wrong, there's nothing you need to be scared of. And that book it's a really fantastic book, which really goes into actually talking to the pain and visualizing it, and a lot of things. He gives a lot of tools like that, which I work through with clients as well, and we go through a lot of like the pain brain connection, and how we can talk to it like it's a small baby, and you say it's fine.
I'm getting every single podcast so far, getting book recommendations that are just like, I'm so excited to read all of these. We do this in emotional release, but much more like a meditative state. So tracking any sensation that's maybe past trauma, not necessarily active pain you're feeling in the moment. So yeah, I am loving this conversation. Thank you so much for giving all of this input. The last thing I want to touch on, because we've covered a lot of things for people if they are suffering from IC, but there's also a lot of people who perhaps their partners, perhaps their family member, someone they know is suffering from it. So is there anything that people can do to support the people in their life?
It's difficult, because when you're in that position, do you know what the worst thing is you feel, and I know it, and I tell all my clients off for this, but I've been in that position. Well, I don't tell them off, but we talk about this in depth. It's the guilt that you feel, because you can't do anything. It's like you become like you're a shell, like you're a broken shell. That's how you feel, because you think, well, I've still got life in me, like I want to do these things and I just can't. And so it's very, very difficult, because you feel such guilt. And the only thing that I can say, so my poor partner Alfie, he was sort of with me through the worst of it, and we were alone in Australia with no support network, and really, he was the person that went through the majority of it with me, and all he did and all he could do was honestly hold my hand, you know, get hot compresses, make me food, and just tell me that it was all going to be fine. And it's actually, being on the outside, you're not going to understand it. You're never going to understand it because it's such a bizarre thing to be going through. But the only thing that you can do is listen to somebody and believe them and tell them that actually it is going to get better, and do pick up the slack where you basically can't because you're unable to do it. Like you don't have the strength really, because also fatigue is a really big thing with IC. And it's just picking up the slack, listening to you, holding your hand, and telling you that it's actually all going to be fine. And that's it. That's pretty much it. It's all you can do, I would say, from the outside. And it's really difficult for people on the outside to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so difficult to explain when you're the person feeling it.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, you're very, very lucky to have such a partner to support you through this as well. It's
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really, really lucky. And, you know, a lot of the time for people, it's not the same, and they don't have that, you know, that support and that luck.
Yeah.
But, you know, he was brilliant through it. And you need help. And a lot of the time people are actually scared to ask for help as well. But when you're going through something so traumatic, because it is traumatic, you need help, and you've got to ask for help and remove that blame and that guilt from yourself, because that's just going to make things worse, to be honest.
Wow. This has been very insightful and knowledge bombing all over. How at the moment can people find you and work with you? And I will obviously share all of your links, but yeah, what kind of offering are you supporting women with at the moment?
Yes, so I'm currently, I do programs with women. So at the moment it's a 4-month program, and what we do is I run testing. So we do some hair testing. And it looks at the hormone, the gut, pathogens, you know, parasites. It looks at vitamin deficiencies, mineral deficiencies. Like it's like a whole body. Imagine you're a car and you need a service, and this is what we do. So I work with a naturopath in the UK, and we do the testing through her. And she then will come back with everything of what you should be taking, to whoever the person is working with me to take to help to bring the body back into balance. And then what we do is we work through a full elimination diet together. We work through pain in the brain. We work through the hormones, gut, the nervous system's huge. We do emotional release techniques. We do all of these different things, and you have basically a one-stop shop for 4 months. And it's it's a program basically to educate you on what you can do to work to reduce those symptoms back down. You know, obviously with, you know, putting the work in on a client end, we are really seeing fantastic results. People coming out of it pain free, people coming out of it with pain back to a 1. Like, I'm seeing such wonderful results with my clients who are really putting in the work to themselves. And it's a 4-month deep dive, but it then extends further than that into, you know, this is a lifelong thing of keeping that nervous system down and keeping the body back in balance. Health with Joana, which is spelled Joana, all one word. My website, I'm redoing all of, but that will be up and running. Well, it is up and running. It's just being edited and changed at the moment. And that's kind of what I'm doing. So
I mean, I love that you're empowering people to be their own self-healers, and this is everything that is in line with the ethos of not just my own life, but INTUNE, and really showing people and highlighting people in the world who are helping others do this. So again, just thank you so much for taking the time, and I can't wait for this episode to go out because it's really yeah, it's really an important topic. So
yeah, it is, absolutely, it is, it really is. And I never thought I could get so much joy from urinating, but you know what, here we are.
It's really good.
Really, really good.
Amazing, Joanna. I'm gonna say thank you so much, and I really hope to have you back on here again soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Perfect.